Welcome to Spymasters. I'm your new host, Paul Burke, and I'm the editor of Aspects of Crime, and I'm currently working on an encyclopedia of spy fiction. Also, my first book, Spies on Screen, From Silent to Streaming, will be published this September. My interest in the world of espionage is a 40-year love of both fiction and non-fiction, and so I hope to bring you some fascinating interviews in the coming months. If I achieve that, it'll be in keeping with the highest standards set by Antonia Senior. Antonia is going to be focusing on her new account of the Cambridge Five, her book, Stalin's Apostles, the Cambridge Five and the Making of the Soviet Empire, which is published on the 9th of April. It's a comprehensive history with the latest available research. It's insightful and pacey as a thriller, and I'd urge you to check it out. And please don't forget, Antonia will still be hosting the History Books Buff podcast with historian Roger Morehouse. And they have a lot of fun, so don't forget to catch up with her there. I wanted to say thank you to Antonia for making Spymasters a go-to podcast within the genre. I have an awful lot to live up to, so thank you on behalf of Aspects of History, Spymasters, and all the listeners and viewers, Antonia. Back to today. My guest is Adrian Munsey, and his new documentary, also called Spymasters, is a 4-part series beginning on Sky Arts at 9 p.m. on the 31st of March. The show will intrigue fans of the spy world and spy fiction and film. This is a history of the 20th century to date and focuses on the growing intersection between geopolitical reality and the writer's world. Well, hello, Adrian, and welcome to Spymasters.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, you noticed the coincidence there. We're going to be talking about Spymasters, your show, and we are Spymasters podcast.
Well, very good taste on both our parts, I hope.
Well, look, just before we start talking about Spymasters itself, you've had quite an eclectic career. I mean, we are talking about TV and film and music and being a writer, and recently been involved, of course, in writing, producing, and directing documentaries. So I suppose, in a sense, I was wondering, because there's very great variety of topics. You know, you covered Kipling and Forster and World War II, children, science fiction, of course, spying and graphic art. And I just wonder, is there a sort of an underlying sort of project for you there? Is there something that underpins them? Is there a theme, a vision, maybe?
Well, I don't think I had one to begin with, but I think in the end I was concerned about biography,
Mm,
the viewer's biography, our biography, and the relationship between what appears to be true, what is there a true, this idea of making of identity, this idea of the private and the public. And the spy seems to me, and espionage and intelligence, interesting word, intelligence, um, it seems to cross these worlds, which, there are certain disciplines, perhaps like philosophy and even psychoanalysis, which have been interested in this, what's real, a
mm.
meta perspective. But we're all in this extraordinary world, inner and outer. And I've found in the end that this particular subject I found completely pervasive and persuasive. And I've found it almost a curious sort of home in a way. And I hope I can continue to be interested in it.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I kind of got that impression anyway from watching the shows. I've seen all 4 now. They'll be going out on the 31st of March on Sky. I'm curious about how you came to this. Let's set it up. You know, you mentioned there how you fell in love with the subject, if you like, or with its relationship with the real world. What kind of led you here in the first place?
Well, I can give you the kind of real answer, which is that Sky Arts asked me to, and we had this series of Wonderland, and that is an interesting
Right.
word, Wonderland. And this, they now have, the title has been dropped, Wonderland, and so it is just Spy Masters. But we started with the wonder of a child's world with a series on children's literature. But
Right.
it's this question of what is wonder? What is this place of conjecture or wish? An ideal world or not an ideal world? What is wondering? It's a intelligence. It is spying on ourselves and on the worlds we live in, which, we start with our family and we end with a bigger world and possibly a smaller world as we get older as well.
Mm. That's an interesting point. I mean, that's true, isn't it? We begin as spies, don't we, as children? It's something we're doing. We're spying on the adult world the whole time to learn.
Well, we don't know anything, and
Mm,
we're surrounded by these adults who certainly claim to know a great deal, often for our own good, it is said.
indeed.
And we have to work out, often without power, rather like the spy, because the spy, as we say in the series, the spy won't be backed up when they're in trouble. They can't be backed up
Mm,
if they're really in trouble. Though obviously the SIS and MI6 and other intelligence agencies wish to look after their spies, but of course there are traitors, all kinds of traitors, many, many, not just in England. Everybody knows Philby, but we can look at America, and then this extraordinary uh, person who was the secretary to the Ferrous Metals Association,
yeah, right.
and who communicated to the nuclear secrets to the Russians. She was secretary to the director of the and when asked why she'd done it, when doorstepped by somebody, and it's all in the film, and she said to stop the Third World War. Intriguing answer, which I leave it to viewers to decide what they make of that.
You did, and you did leave it that way in the film with Melita Norwood. It's very interesting, actually, that what you've done here, because I mean, people have done documentaries about spy fiction before. They've done documentaries about the real world of spies before. But in essence, what you chose to do was to marry the two together. And you talk about the interconnectivity. Can you give me some background on that, really, please?
Well, the history of the world where spying has been a major factor, and I think, as you point out, it's 1821 or thereabouts was the first spy fiction.
Yes, yeah.
That it's the intersection of history and representation that's interested me. That in general, often we don't know about our own history until afterwards, whether it's the 50-year rule or the
Yes.
70-year rule or all these other things. So we're at a disadvantage as spectators of history that we don't know. And I think that's why we're interested in espionage and spying and intelligence. Can we find out earlier? And of course, nation states have to do that because, as Christopher Andrews says in the film, if you don't know what other states are intending to do, you're potentially in tremendous trouble. So this idea of the defense of the realm, I find of great interest and of great significance. And it's set against the ambiguity of worlds represented by Le Carre and others, which have engaged people in thinking that it's a treacherous world, it's an ambiguous world where betrayal may be the dominating factor. But I think you've got this clash between the defense of the realm and the need to recognize that there's been betrayals within intelligence. There's amounts of secrets given away both within the United States and within America to the Russians and vice versa. In
Mm-hmm.
the film, you see Gordievsky, who was head of Russian intelligence in England and account of and working for the British as well, called back to Russia, but he also knew he must go because unless he could communicate to the Allies, the West that is, that the Russians were mistaking war games for a first strike, that the Russians would launch a first strike first. And as I hope we portray in the film, he was got out by British intelligence, the Russian to the Finnish border, and he only got out. They're about to open the boot of the car where he was, when suddenly the wife of a British diplomat, who I understand lives in Somerset now,
Right.
threw her baby's nappy onto the ground, and the dogs got so interested in that the car was waved through. Well, if you want to know how close the world got to nuclear war, that's as good as you can get, really.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely fascinating. I knew the story of Gordievsky, of course, and the intelligence that he delivered, but I did not know that story about how he escaped. And I mean
Well,
that what we're talking about there, when we talk about spies, there's a lot of fear in the spy world. There must be in that living that kind of life. But that was by the skin of his teeth, effectively.
well, I tried to follow the example of Michael Caine, who is obviously one of his well-known saying is not many people know
Know
that.
that.
And I tried to have a number of things in the film that I hoped that not many people knew.
I think that's true, and I think also you make connections that people won't have made for themselves. I think that's one of the things. Do you think then that having then done all this work, written this thing that you realize that, in a sense, spy fiction is the most closely connected kind of literary genre to the real world because it is all about the geopolitics.
Well, I have become a complete fan, I have to say, both of
Good,
the
good.
writers and the work and the people. I find whether it's Len Deighton, who interestingly went to the Royal College of Art and was a wonderful illustrator, and St Martin's College of Art, which of course I'm pleased about because a million years ago I went to one of those institutions.
Right.
And so I'm intrigued that the artists have a place in describing that. And I think that's what I interests me about Ian Fleming and of course John le Carre, the idea of making identity, the idea of creation is this total ambiguity between history and the present, between public and private, between honesty and betrayal.
Mm.
And there's a sense in which people may have even the notion of the persona uh, arguably maybe betraying the inner self for reasons of survival. These are so wonderfully psychological world we're in, and yet at the same time, if you're a spy, you're on your own. And I think that is extraordinarily interesting, the isolation of the people who become spies and possibly of many of the writers as well.
I think so, yeah. I mean, one of the things that struck me, I was just talking to somebody last night about Len Deighton because sadly Len Deighton recently died. Um, thank God he made the good age of a 97 at least. But no, one of the things that struck me, you said there about art. And I'm curious, I think in a way that because he was a person who was used to looking at the world, he was involved in what was going on in young world as well. In the 60s, was a very changing time. I think that may have given him an insight. And whereas you say we know the decades when we look back on them, he's somebody who was writing about them at the time and knew obviously what he was seeing in front of him.
But I also think the sense of humor in Len Deighton's
Mm,
fascinating because, the Freudian definition of humor is that it allows things to be said which can't be said in traditional speech.
right.
And so Len Deighton, I mean, there's wonderful scenes of the silence in the reading room when a malevolent person is confronted by Michael Caine, but he's able to say shh
Yes. Yeah,
because
it's
of
very clever. And that, of course, is a massive difference with Le Carre. The humor in Dayton is there, and it's really not
indeed.
there in Le Carre.
Yes, there's not many laughs in Le Carre, though I do think when he speaks himself, there's a geniality
Mm,
there. And I found also this question of fathers interesting, that Ian Fleming's father was killed when he was very
yeah, when
small
he was young, yeah.
in battle, and John le Carre's father was a deeply ambiguous figure. And the idea that made people wanting to explore worlds in which you knew a lot quickly. In other words, the spy writer has seen that having personae, having the idea that you need to know more in order to survive, or the
Mm.
nation to survive, the nation being a metaphor for the individual, possibly. And can you trust the father? Is the father trustworthy? Uh, these notions seem to me to be around in, well, much spy
No,
fiction.
you're absolutely right. They are. I think that's the point. I mean, when I didn't know about John le Carre's life and about his father, which we didn't really know until he started writing The Perfect Spy, which of course was in a lot of ways about his father, was that when you actually then know his life story, you realize how much of his life story is what transfers into the fiction. And it is also, that does relate to this thing as well about the state, because the relationship with the human being and the state is also akin to a relationship between a father and a son.
Well, I also think that now people are becoming possibly, I mean, The Guardian says that people are less trusting of the state now
Mm,
than they were. And so, this idea of how are individuals or families or not families, how are you to make sense of what's happening to you? This idea that intelligence, and that's the word for the official organizations, but it may be in a way what you need yourself to
mm,
try and understand the world. I mean, there's this I mean, I don't want to emphasize Freud, but the idea that in Vienna at the turn of the century, there needed to be a new understanding of what was troubling people. I sense that spy fiction is now dealing with this. People are more troubled than they were. I mean,
Yes.
we're witnessing a very troubling period as we speak.
Yeah.
And this, how do you get hold of something to give you a sense of a binding post, to keep your boat afloat? It's difficult for people.
It is, and I think you're right. I think these are the most troubling times since the Cold War, and we know the rise in spy fiction at the time during the Cold War was down to that.
I think that's a tremendously important point you've just made. I think that's on the button.
There's a curious point that just struck me as well. What you were saying about, how we trust government less. And I think that started after the Second World War. I think people were less reverent, let's say, to start with. And that's sort of developed over time. But at the same time, we are also handing over more trust in terms of giving our social media and our computers and things control over our lives, all the things we do in a way at
Well,
the same
yes,
time.
you could describe it though as people are taking more from us uh,
Mm,
in return for a service of some kind. Something terribly important is taken from us. And without going into the sort of philosophy of the internet, whether it's feudal rather than cross
yeah, right.
border, that seems to be something which is troubling people. There's a sense in which people may feel they're at the mercy of powers, be it holding on for customer service longer than you'd like to, or more serious, inverted commas, threats. But the idea of the threat, which espionage and intelligence is constantly dealing with, again, that's why I was interested in trying to describe it. And I was also interested in looking at some of the historical events which suggest that trust was not always being reciprocated. And one
Mm,
thinks certain of the intelligence activities, both by many intelligence organizations of all nation states, were pretty things which you might argue as not human took place.
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And one of the things you did, you didn't just look at the fiction, of course, in terms of books, you actually looked at the films. And that's a really important point, isn't it? Because when you talk about film and you talk about the TV dramas and so on, we're talking about much bigger audiences.
Well, you see, that's right. And two or three of the contributors in the film really say people know spy fiction through the films.
Yeah.
And whether it's John le Carre or any other writers, John le Carre's did a very good interview where he said, I hope people will read the books after they've seen the films. And then some people will have done. And there's that wonderful Terry Wogan joke, really, when Tinker Tailor was on television. He was having a competition to wonder who on earth knew what was going on. But
Suppose that there is an element of that. I think one of the points you make very early on in the film, though, about Bond, for instance, is that it's not just, well, we see it as fantasy, and it is fantasy fiction in the sense that you have this ridiculously heroic figure and the guns and bombs and whistles and everything that go with it. But it all comes from a real place, doesn't it?
well, I think Ian Fleming's deeply underrated in his
Mm,
actions. Really, he did write, it is said, one of the papers which created the CIA,
yeah,
and
absolutely. I've read it.
and those gadgets, which again we say this in the film, that President Zelensky's father, professor of computing at Kyiv University, they created the telephone-controlled tops to container trucks, which released the drones at a distance, which destroyed a third of the Russian bomber fleet. So
Yeah,
this
quite true.
gadget thing, which we laugh about and call entertainment, now I'm sure we in Britain are wishing we had more drones and more gadgets, as Laura Koonsberg worries about missiles coming to London.
Yeah, absolutely. You start this survey actually going right the way back. It's Christopher Andrews who mentions it actually when you start talking about the Bible
God,
and
yes,
God.
God
Yeah,
being the first spy master.
yeah,
Well, if you've got any sense, We all have to be a spy master to have any idea what's going on at all around us. Well, I don't mean that to be flippant about that. I
No,
think,
no, I understand, but it is true that there are stories of spies in the Bible. And since that time, they've come through forward through Shakespeare and they've come forward through Dickens. Yeah, the spy novel itself doesn't start until sort of around just before the First World War to be a serious art form that takes off. But it's always been in literature.
yes. And I like the chap who wrote These Foolish Things, head of light entertainment at the BBC, who was an important spy, and
Yes,
Bertram Mills running a circus, which certainly as a child I went to, being a very important spy. And there is despite, I'm sure, the activity not being, having much to laugh about in it, the context and some of the participants, that well, there is a certain, well, is it a divine comedy? Well, the divine comedy, of course, may be a tragedy. That's the trouble. Um, um, but that's why I think that's why so many people have embraced spy literature. And dare I say it, why your forthcoming encyclopedia may be very timely indeed. I think
certainly hope
people are
so.
using it as a sort of ordnance survey map.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I mean, that was the whole purpose. In fact, I saw so many things that we were sort of looking at the same way in your film and in what I was doing with the book, which is, a deeper survey without being disrespectful. But the point about it was that relationship between the real world and the spy world. And I
Yes.
like, for instance, that what you discover over this sort of landscape of time is that if we take those early novels and you have experts talk about Hannay and the John Buchan at the start, and we follow a path through as the program goes along. How they're sort of reinforcing our values, ours as in the Western values of the time, and things like empire, even those sorts of things, heroic figures, and how we get to this change after the Second World War, where things do very dramatically change with the Cold War.
Well, yes, I think that's why I find, well, I know that everybody knows about John le Carre, but I find his feeling, his own fascination with Philby and his feeling, his respect for the Russian Cold War intelligence officers, and feeling that he never thought he would have become a crossed over, but he had a time for their what I think he thought was some aspects of their dignity, really. Then I find Le Carre's disappointment at the end of the Cold War that nothing better came out of it. I find
Mm.
that a telling thing. The idea, perhaps, that the fathers of the world were not in the end to be trusted, and that I think the interest in how really powerful John le Carre's criticisms of history post Cold War, where I found that important, really.
Yeah, that's very interesting because one of the things that we you do talk about in the show is sort of the failure of intelligence at sometimes, how they miss some of the great moments in history, the big
Ah,
things that shift that happen. And one of those is at the end of the Cold War, of course, nobody's really thinking about the fact that somewhere down the road we could be back in a new Cold War.
well, events seem to have been in front of our eyes
Right.
without. Now you're seeing a kind of curious return of the repressed almost. The idea that what we thought would happen hasn't happened. Um, and we're entering a period, it seems, of harsh power,
Mm.
and the importance of intelligence services seems to me to be enhanced by what's happened. And you really hope, as indeed I understand recently, the understanding of the number of plot activities, even against Britain, has, I think the MI5 and MI6 have discovered 19 or 20 separate
Yeah.
plots.
Yeah, it's going up. Yeah. There are lots of
And
those.
we found some footage of, in the East End of London, the Wagner group were blowing up warehouses. and the idea that so many of the people talk about that throughout Europe there's a great deal more sabotage going on than you might expect.
There is, it's a funny thing that I don't know why we don't connect that up. I mean, we do know of these things. It's there in the press if you want to see it. But it's quite surprising that people don't connect that back to what they consider to be spying, which might be that real conflict between two powers that's obvious because it's public.
Well, you put your finger on it, haven't you? We've sort of watched in slow motion
Mm,
events occurring, and somehow we've not been able to realize perhaps we can't. Perhaps there is a sort of almost Oedipal blindness,
mm,
that there's a sense in which some of the things that are happening are arguably so disturbing, yet they're not, because is it real? And so there's this blurring, and that's one of the things I was hoped might come across in the film a bit. You're entering an area, a public area of imagery and words, where it's very hard to distinguish between what you're feeling or an opinion you might or might not have, and an opinion somebody else is having, and events. So you've entered a world in which it's very hard to get true north. Is there a
yeah,
true north anymore? And so to some extent, the almost the loyalty of it, let us say, an intelligence service is the nearest you're going to get to a North Star, the defense of the realm, because that's what people are talking about now. They're talking about energy security. They're
yes,
talking about all kinds of things which sound like only occur in a war. Yet there appear to be now in our present world characteristics of war in situations which may not look like wars. And that, I mean, I don't know in the end any more about this than anybody else does. So all I could try and do was portray through images and text from writers and from experts a kind of, is it a map or is it an impression? I hope there was a bit of a map about it. It wasn't, I tried not to be impressionistic in what we were doing.
no, no, no. It felt very clear, and I think there are lots of important questions that you did ask in all of that. For instance, there's a big question about spying, which we understand in the context of the novel as being us and them. But the context that backs that up is, well, actually, sometimes it's the people behind you who are more dangerous to you than the people in front of you that you're looking at. That's one aspect. But the other thing is the relationship between the state and the individual. Because even in a democracy, they do things, they spy on us
Uh,
in ways. Spy novel, in a funny way, is sort of the anti spy novel because it's not about, once you get to the 1960s, once you get to the realist spy novel, it's not about actually supporting the system, it's about questioning the system.
it certainly is, and the I mean, that's the irony about it, and I think that raises a problem. You see that um, many people within MI6, despite liking reading things like John le Carre, worried that it undermined the commitment to intelligence, or people may have an unduly cynical attitude towards it. So I'm just repeating what they say. Um, it's an interesting question, I think.
Mm. Yeah, I think so. And as I said, now picking apart what we were saying a little bit earlier, I mean, the next point about that is that you've got in a spy novel, you will have the us and them, and that's very clear in a James Bond novel. But there's always somebody in the background who's a traitor. There's the mole. There's things like that, and there's the office politics which play up very much in, say, Mick Herron, you know. And it's this idea that your own side is as dangerous to you as the enemy.
But you see, that seems to me to be I don't know if it's a macrocosm or a microcosm, but that seems to be a representation of our daily
Absolutely,
personal lives as well, at work,
absolutely.
in the family, or not the family, divorce, relationships with parents, with children. There are these same characteristics that occur between nations occur in our own lives. And so we're walking in almost, I don't know if you'd call it a theatre of cruelty, but it's certainly a theatre of ambiguity. Uh,
I think that's a good way of putting it. Yes. Because the other thing that strikes me is this relationship between the individual and the state, and how the state winds up, even in a democracy, not being as benign as maybe you might think it is. I mean, we know in dictatorships, we know, for instance, in East Germany, you show the film Lives of Others in the documentary. What it must have been like to live under the Stasi, we can't imagine. But at the same time, we don't have absolute freedoms. Our government is watching us too.
Yes. And this question of how benevolent can the state be is, I think, an overriding question. And I think you could argue, if you're being dramatic about it, that people's despair about this is what's led them to a greater interest in spy fiction and spy films, because of a certain despair that almost new relationship created, let us say, in Britain after the Second World War, has now become so um, affected by, whether it's by money or by political ideas or by dis, dissension within the population between interest groups. That's where are people to get their certainty from, and they're almost. I mean, I'm afraid I'm interested in Keynes and in economics, that the Bretton
Hmm.
Woods in 1944, the world got together to try and create, whether it was forms of welfare state or forms of uh, I mean, Keynes lost the argument about Bancor, where surpluses and deficits would be swapped over for the greater good. And
Yeah.
that idealistic world lost out to Dexter White, Russian agent, intriguingly, in charge of the
Mm.
American negotiations. So I feel that we're coming back now to these questions being asked about how do you get what in the past might have been called idealism. But this is John le Carre's point, of course, is that nation states create the very problems which then become the problems that that have to be dealt with. And electorates have their responsibilities about this, though they're unwilling to own them. Now, that I think that's the idealistic analysis, that if only it could be better. But there's certainly the issues that are being dealt with in now within spy fiction. They're taking these things head on, be it whether it be democracies, challenges to democracies, the actions to malevolent states, which I hope that comes over in the film, that
Hmm.
we underestimate the amount of intelligence from malevolent states affecting media without almost us knowing that it's democracy, arguably, and it's certainly the intention of states is to destabilize it in Germany, in Britain, other countries. And I think that we don't imagine that's happening.
I agree with you. Are we, in a sense, almost at war without realizing we're at war?
I think it's an intelligence war.
Mm.
And I think that, but why individuals must want to read spy fiction is we're almost powerless, given the power that a number of leaders in the world have. Uh, we're almost powerless to do anything about it. So it's as if we're seeking understanding, so to at least ameliorate anxiety.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I absolutely agree with you. Because I think one of the things that the whole story that's in the documentaries leads up to this point at the end where you're looking at the modern world and we're talking about the situation in China. We're talking about the situation of the possibility of a new Cold War. Also, though, things like AI and quantum mechanics and other things that we don't even understand what they will do.
Well, AI is a fascinating area which has not been subject to the kind of intelligence of spy writers yet, though I wouldn't be surprised that there's an interesting book to be written about the errors made within AI answers,
Absolutely.
undeclared, and only and not assumed, not
Mm.
presumed. That you're beginning to get things now at the bottom saying that mistakes are made. But I've asked AI some questions a little bit about this film, not much, but you get some answers which definitely don't look right to me. Uh,
Absolutely. No, I've done the same thing. I think the thing is, though, because we have this experience behind us, we can actually interrogate the answers you get in a sense. If you're a new generation and you've grown up and this is your access to information in the first place, then you don't have the tools to interrogate it in the same way, do you?
well, you've made a really profound point there. That is almost the point. It's not so much the intelligence, it's almost the disappointment to ask those questions, because um, we're being sold pretty hard the
Mm.
benefits of certain kinds of technology. And I must say, just it surprises me the vigor with and unrestrained and uncritical vigor that certain things are being presented by nation states. Indeed, if you
Mm.
listen to um, a number of governments, including our own, talking about AI, it's surprisingly uncritical.
Absolutely. I think we fall into this category where we do something first and then try and look for the safeguards afterwards. And that never works. But we do it with
Well,
everything.
well, you see, you've made another killer point there. That's the criticism of why is it that, and that's why I think intelligence is interesting. And Christopher Andrews says it in our film. It's the things you don't know that you have to ask about. It's the
Yes.
mistakes
Right.
that you don't know that you've made you've got to ask about. Now that I think people would find depressing, but it's only in a way. I mean, it's again going back to psychoanalysis. I mean, the early analysts used to feel that unless you're willing to be depressed, you're never going to learn anything, and it's our unwillingness to feel bad that prevents us from having certain kinds of knowledge. Be you be Oedipus at Colonus, who certainly got his knowledge
Yes.
there, but he didn't get it before.
No,
Poor.
indeed. No, it's a very good point because I think one of the things that you could say about a vision of the world that some people have, and it's something I think that you pointed out that modern spy novelists and probably since Le Carre actually have been doing, which is this trying to bust these kind of myths. But for instance, the crazy myth that, for instance, our spies are good guys doing something in a good cause, whereas their spies are bad guys, and they're obviously got malevolent causes and they're obviously wrong.
Well, here we have the dilemma of everything from woke to conservatism, the
Mm,
dilemma of everything from right to left, everything from uncritical
yeah, you're right.
opinions to a certain amount of knowledge. And I do think what you're talking about is our best chance of a more realistic understanding of our world. But if you live in a comparatively small country like Britain, which certainly readers of British spy fiction and watchers of British spy film and television are increasingly realize they do, I think part of it is our understanding that in Britain, the scale of the reduction, even
Mm,
if it's not it is in my lifetime, but in young people's lifetime, the even notion of a British Empire, I think, is probably gone, instead people have perhaps taken refuge in critical opinion about it. But that is at one remove, and it may leave out some quite important historical things. I mean, one thing which we do mention in the film is that MI6 in Ghana and Nigeria were liberal. That
yeah.
they helped. In other parts, in Kenya and Malaysia, the policy was much more harsh, and that's an understatement, probably.
Yes. No, I take your point. I see what you mean. Yeah. Plus, everything's changed. We've had a sort of a century where we've had a rough idea, I think, of where things were going in terms of the West and allies and things like that. We've now entered a new age, and this again is something that comes out as the documentary goes along, where we're in a. We've always talked about the uncertainty of this world, but let's put it as it is. I mean, with Trump, with things changing in the world the way they are, we don't even know if things like Five Eyes could exist in the future in the way it does.
Well, again, I have no special information in this at all, but I understand Five Eyes is operating still pretty well.
Yeah, right.
Uh, whether the people who get the Five Eyes information, what they do with it, maybe, I mean, certainly AI is leading a number of governments to be very accurate in their assassination activities and their bombing. Five Eyes was really quite an idealistic idea that it came from a post-war idea that admittedly rather Western dominated.
Yes, absolutely.
But actually, and that, again, I go back to things like The Constant Gardener and novels dealing with and films dealing with Africa, the global south, the spies understand better uh, the human experience of those countries. And it's that disconnect,
Mm.
perhaps the politicians might say necessarily, it's the disconnect between the felt experience described in the novel and the film and the policy decisions that are taken by people who are in charge of graphic and
Yeah.
consequential policies.
But of course, like any human experience, what you actually understand when you have empathy is when you understand people on a personal level. So when you understand the pain that things cause, when you understand the grief that these issues cause, and that, of course, is what we're talking about in the novels.
Well, if you were being optimistic, I think you'd say that people's interest in the historical and contemporary effects of the human condition in relationship to geopolitics, that may be a sign. Could it be a sign of maturity in in a number of countries? Uh, and that's the interest. I mean, I'm interested, you see, that spy fiction is beginning to have a run. It's not a competition against true crime,
No, right.
but you begin to feel that espionage and intelligence fiction is having a run up, and in chart terms is a high riser.
Yes,
You know?
absolutely.
And I think that's because people are beginning to understand. I hope it's because people are beginning to understand you're more likely to find out something that's really useful to you, whether it's in the personal sense or the collective sense. That's what would make me optimistic about. I think I mean, I know you've got 5,000 books. That may be an understatement. You must yourself have been so fully aware of the almost the, I don't want to sound soppy, but the generous effect of spy writing is to almost humanize history because it's the connection between the
Yes,
personal and the
yes,
general.
yeah, absolutely. I think that's the point. It does manage to connect that geopolitical and something on such a grand scale, the grandest scale, because you see it in these really human terms. When you see Lemus on the wall, who dies, in that moment, it's a love story. It's his possible redemption, and we understand why something personal matters to him that is not what his bosses care about.
And that his bosses, without giving away the story, which we better not, I suppose,
Right.
that the people he trusted, or half, three quarters trusted, and I'll do dot, dot, dot now, but I think I know everybody talks about the spy who came in from the
Mm.
cold, but as a description of the individual's fate who participates fully in the public geopolitical world, as the tragedy of the losses that he felt and the sacrifice that he chose to make, it's almost a kind of it's a crucifixion you're seeing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
I think that's the greatness of, well, much of John le Carre's writing. And in a different way, I think Ian Fleming, who gets talked about as entertainment, he in a way was giving us some really good things for the defense of the realm. You see, get more drones. Never mind the aircraft carriers, get those drones.
So he was a very smart man, and then in terms of his actual intelligence work, and as you say, some of the reports that he wrote and so on, he clearly knew exactly what he was doing. I do think as well, of course, that one of the things about the Le Carre, the Ian Fleming stories in the books is that they are incredibly different to the films as well. And I think people who only know the films will have a
Yes.
different understanding of where Fleming is coming from.
Yes, and I think you made a fantastic point, which I hope I might make another film about this. When Cubby Broccoli came along only 2 years before Ian Fleming's death, my goodness me, the significance for MI6 was pretty big. Cubby Broccoli has really helped MI6 and James Bond so much.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a true thing, I think, to say that when we were declining in terms of the British Empire at the end of the Second World War, when the role of Britain and the significance of Britain was declining, one of the things that actually was balancing against that and pushing us back to the top of the pile, if you like, was actually spy fiction. Because of Bond, who was giving this impression of Britain being something greater and grander than it was, world saviors even.
Well, 200%. That's the sign of British creativity. You know, the world of Shakespeare and Kipling and Tennyson. Of course, we can imaginatively. And I think this now diverse nation of ours, I'm very optimistic about it. And I remember the 2.5 million volunteers in the Indian Army who were fighting for their own country as well as
Yes,
the British Empire. But
yes,
interestingly, the British Empire, with its great diversity, at least for all its faults, it did pretty well between 39 and 45. And that's that you hope that the British, who, as you have pointed out, are preeminent in sky fiction. You know, when Ian Fleming bumped into Senator Kennedy and then got asked out to dinner with Alan Dulles, who then
yes,
wrote a
right.
spy book, thank goodness for that. I mean, well, I don't know. Well, Tim Weiner's book on the CIA is a fantastic book, and
It is, yes.
which we won't go into now, but or
No,
make
but
any
there are some
make any
fantastic.
rude remarks about any other intelligence organizations.
No, no, but it is fascinating. Actually, I think as what we've illustrated here, I think too, is that spy fiction is very alive to re-examining history, and in the process of re-examining history, find it. For instance, there are a lot more books now about women in spy fiction because somebody opened the door and said, and it was women said, look, you can write about female characters, and all of a sudden we're writing about female characters who are incredibly interesting and incredibly important parts of the story.
Well, Paul, you should have made the film really, because I think that's pretty important what you've just said.
You did
I,
you did a pretty damn good job,
I
honestly.
I think
I don't
that,
think you needed me.
well, I don't know about that actually. I'm hoping to do another one, which I would like. I didn't expect to be interested, and it was, I have to say, it was Sky's idea out of Wonderland, Sky Arts' idea. It was,
So serendipity works sometimes.
Jack Oliver and Philip Edgar Jones, and I mean, it's been a complete, I mean, I'm nearly 120, so to me, it's been a tremendous gift to be given this opportunity to look at this world, and it's given me almost a new education. And I won't say who this refers to, but there is one Wikipedia entry which says that one of the people in our film recruited more spies than anybody else in Britain, but I wouldn't dream of saying who that was.
We'll leave that to the audience to figure out for themselves. I mean, this is a brilliant film in the sense that I do love the way you connect the real world with the spy fiction world and show how they reflect each other and, how we are looking for answers in that world as well. But I think for a lot of people, there'll be an awful lot of eye-opening moments in the film.
Well, I'm hoping this does well. I'm hoping people are interested in it. As I say, I found the experience of being uh, almost allowed to try and find out what I can. Obviously, because I don't go into the sheer level of detail that might arguably be necessary, but I hope we did cover quite a lot of history. The decolonization
Mm,
period interested me a lot, and the not entirely reprehensible. The MI6 had, were pretty interesting in many parts of Africa, and that's another story which we could be wonderful to go into, the
but
Congo.
there's a whole other Cold War, isn't there, in Africa and
Yeah,
India and Asia and
absolutely.
mm,
And that is again, the honourable schoolboy. Uh,
right.
that world, which is even Le Carre is only in a way hinting at it. Our lack of knowledge and of what the real experienced history in China and Southeast Asia, Indonesia, um, India, Burma. These
Mm,
are extraordinary. Africa, the Congo, the whole Rwanda, Nkrumah dancing with the Queen, the High Commissioner being friendly. There's all kinds of ambiguities there, which I hope may create a new history that's, in a way more beneficial to all parties. I
I
think
can
it
tell
could
how much
be.
you did fall in love with the subject.
I don't want to leave it in a way because even though inevitably my knowledge is, first, it's not first draft, but I was able to meet people Daniela Richterova and
Yes, right.
the women in the film are splendid. And even to go back to Odette, to have that shot of Colonel Buckmaster
Buckmaster,
from the
yeah.
film, who is a real person. And of course, I just thought that we were in contact with something. That's what I felt about the film, that it allowed you to be in contact with something. And then, this extraordinary quote from Winston Churchill, rather like John le Carre and Ian Fleming, were fathers who were either absent or distant.
Mm.
When Churchill liked le Carre and Fleming said, at the end of the, I wonder if my father would be proud of me now.
Yes. Yeah.
And so this coincidence of the personal dilemma and the geopolitical reality and the decisions that great men and women have to make within it, and how much serendipity, how much chance there is in it, how much information, if only there was more information.
Mm.
That's why, looking for moles that is an interesting subject. In a way, le Carre is talking about looking, how can you get nearer to truths? Can you get nearer to the facts?
Yes.
The
Absolutely.
pragmatic facts which are affecting lives, not philosophical truths or correct opinions, but what makes for a better world. That's why I keep going back to the end of the Second World War, that time when so many nations got together and were relatively disinterestedly prepared to try and not do it again. And of course, look, there we are at it again.
I don't know. It's one of those weird things that we tend to get bored with things very quickly. And I don't mean to be too flippant with that. But for instance, when you take the post-war war trials, the war crimes trials, people in the end, we didn't prosecute everybody. People got fed up with it. They just had enough of that process.
Well, you see, you put your finger on something there. And even in contemporary events, there's a
Mm.
hint of that occurring. I think that's very interesting. So in the end, you see, that's why you're left almost with the isolated spy, you see, because the fact of the individual spy's life is they're on their own. And that's
Yes.
what got to me, is the loneliness of the public spirited. You wouldn't go into it just to be nasty, maybe a few people do. It's that curious mixture of being willing to cross over the worlds of personal and public, of betrayal and not betrayal, of cruelty and kindness,
Yes.
on honesty and dishonesty, for the greater good, and was it the greater good? That's why the spy who came from the cold is so.
Yeah.
Are
And that
we
that is
allowed in
absolutely
from the cold
fascinating.
ever?
Mm. No, that is fascinating because it is a question. Is it the greater good, or is it just the self-interest of that group of people who have power at any one time that you're supporting? And then you ask questions about, well, as a spy, how much do you surrender of those values and things that you may have for yourself towards what you believe to be a greater good, or what you can talk yourself into thinking is a greater good? And that is the sort of thing that comes out in a novel when you're dealing with the spy. That's fascinating.
Well, you see, that's why, in a way, Lendation's interesting, because there's the comic aspects is, in a way, the only way you can deal with it is that sort of wonderful Dudley Moore phrase where Jonathan Miller is talking about, in Beyond the Fringe, about civil defense. And he says, kill or be killed. And then Dudley Moore says, or both.
Can I ask you then, because you talked a lot about le Carre, and we've talked about so much today actually, but you obviously like le Carre, you obviously liked le Carre's work. Was there other people that struck you? I mean, what did you think of McHerron, for instance?
Well, you see, he's a genius in a way, because
Mm.
he's the post golden age, golden success writer who's managed to turn it into a wonderful mixture of irony and realism
Yes.
and humor. And it's a kind of the victory of defeat, or the defeat of victory. I'm not sure which
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
is.
Yeah.
And so he's a more youthful figure. The whole stance is more youthful. The dilemma, of course, with le Carre, I don't know about the dilemma, but le Carre and they're terribly grown up, if you see what I mean.
Mm.
sense that the identifications are with absent fathers, it could be said.
Yes, yes.
McHenry's not really troubled by that. He's engaged in the real world and has a suitably, I don't know if you'd call it jaded, but he's got a suitably, it's a marvelous stance. I I wonder quite where it gets you in the end, other than to be immensely successful.
Well, it certainly did that. I wonder then, I don't know if you can tell us, but I mean, I do know you know what you're working on next, but I mean, can you tell us something about where you're going after this?
Well, I'm definitely trying to do John le Carré A New Life, and I'm
Right.
definitely trying to do Ian Fleming, and the whole meetings, the chance meeting with Kennedy and Dulles, the CIA, and the gadgets. The idea that beneath this hugely popular uh, phenomenon, actually, for whether it's for Britain or for us, there's a terribly important reality thing there. I would also like to do a general history of MI6, looking more at the so-called move from empire.
Mm. I mean,
I
that is fascinating because one of the things is that they still haven't opened up their records. So, there are things that happened in 1900, and I'm sure they can't be much of a problem now, but they still don't let us know about them.
I think we'd be very concerned about the self-confidence of many imperial policies.
Yes. Mm.
And yet, if we look at the post-colonial histories of so many nation states, virtue appears to be not distributed any more equally.
No, right.
And I don't know where that leaves you. And I think that's why we as individuals turn back to the writers and the films. I do think the films are, because they're a collective phenomenon in a way. The making of them is
Yes,
collective,
it is. Yes, yeah.
and that and almost, if you go to the cinema, the viewing is collective. That's that they're in the same world, aren't they? They're in the
Mm.
same. They're in our world rather than, I suppose, their world. I
Yeah.
suppose that's what it is. It's the individual saying, or the groups of individuals saying, our experience as human beings is as important, if it ever, as the collective geopolitical history, which we
Yes.
only can see in retrospect, or politics, which of course now is dominating our lives. I mean, I don't know how you've found the news presentation, but it's been extremely pervasive
Mm.
and arguably um, not benefiting from the sorts of insights that spy writers and spy filmmakers have. When you look at A
Yes.
Bridge Too Far, and you see what Spielberg was doing with that crossing of the bridge, these worlds are of human dilemmas in public situations.
Yeah,
Yet our
absolutely.
understanding of news, which is why I think we like looking at spy films and spy books, our understanding of news is almost, there's something cut off from it. It's almost like something omitted in plain sight. Um,
That's interesting. That really is a good way of looking at it because I think you can bombard people with so much stuff that it's almost, well, it happened at one point, actually. The CIA decided to release documents. They didn't want people to find things in the documents. So what they did was they dumped millions and millions of documents all at the same time. So you basically couldn't, and it's a bit like that with the news. There's so much stuff thrown at you all the time that it is very difficult to sort of see the line that goes through it.
Well, this is a plug for the film, of course, but Pauline Blistein does say that the reason why um, intelligence organizations have wanted to tell you so much more is it means they don't have to tell you about a lot of the other stuff.
Absolutely. And that
And
is in the film, yeah.
yes, it is in the film. And I, 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 I don't know what that is. You suspect today, listening to the news today, where we're witnessing this ceasefire for 5 days,
Mm.
apparently, though there seems to be some disagreement whether it is or not. What that actually is, maybe we're going to find out in an academic book on history or
Yeah.
a novel.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
though
The
you,
one thing that is very clear, and I do hope the film lands with a lot of people. I do hope that people pay attention here because this is a growing genre, and it does relate so much to what's going on in the real world and how we try to understand what's going on in the real world. Adrian, I've had a great time. Thank you very much.
well, a pleasure, and I must talk more. It's fascinating to. converse about this.
Well, really fascinating indeed, and it would be lovely to chat to Adrian again about spies and spy fiction. The documentary itself, of course, deals with the intersection between reality, the real world, the geopolitics, and spy fiction and films. And so there's something in there for everyone who's interested in this world. Don't forget then that the show itself begins on the 31st of March at 9 p.m. on Sky Arts, and you can catch it there. So a huge thank you to Adrian Munsey for sharing his insight into the show with us. And of course you can pre-order Antonio Senior's book, Stalin's Apostles, and you can get it from all good book outlets. In fact, I'll be back with another interview very shortly, which is actually me talking to Antonio about Stalin's Apostles, and that'll be a 2-episode show. So for now, thank you very much for listening, and bye.
If you're a podcast host, listen up, this one's for you. My name is Allie Jackson. I'm the host of Finding Mr. Height, a dating and relationship podcast that I've been doing for 4 years now, sharing my positive and practical approach to dating that's built on my own life experience. And I wanted to share another experience that I've had, my secret behind monetizing my show. It's called Red Circle, and I was just telling my colleague about how much I love their platform. With Red Circle, not only am I getting a seamless hosting experience, but I also love the support I receive in ad sales. It's not just typical ad sales either. It's targeted opportunities based on my show and my life. And the platform is super simple. You just set your preferences and Red Circle matches you with sponsors that align with your show. You can vet every opportunity and their platform gives you great analytics. More recently too, my Red Circle team has brought me opportunities outside of my podcast on social media to really augment the podcast partnerships, bring them full circle. I just can't recommend them enough. If you want to give it a try, go to redcircle.com to get your free trial. That's redcircle.com for a free trial.